And I just want to show you how grotesque the lies are, the omissions. It's not an accident. It's slander, malicious slander and lies. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Brenton LaTulip. I've been working really hard on Blue Manor Academy, trying to make it the greatest academy in the history of the world, and I do think that we're close. But I haven't made any videos for parents for a little while, and there's a lot of topics that are just burning a hole in my heart. I have to talk about. One of those is Christopher Columbus, and I have done that before. But I watched this video. I did a class actually on Christopher Columbus. It was really great. We went back and we read the source material because he's so controversial all of a sudden. I went back and read the source material, the documents, the letters, the journals. We actually did it as a class. It was really cool. So now I'm very frustrated when I see videos like Adam Ruins Everything, claiming that Christopher Columbus was a genocidal maniac. And I don't think he's the only one. It's actually become, I think, the mainstream view. In fact, whenever I say happy, Columbus Day, there's always a whole litany of people who jump in and, how dare you defend that man? How dare you? Oh, happy Genocide Day, they say. And he's been accused of everything from being a racist, slaver, genocider, pedophile, sex trafficker, basically everything that you could basically do evil. That's what he's accused of doing. The historical record doesn't teach any of that. This comes from basically a man named Howard Zinn. He is a secular Jewish communist. I'd say he's a communist, at least a socialist. He seems to hate, like many of the communist socialists, Western Christianity. And Christopher Columbus is a standard bearer for Western Christianity. In fact, if you read his first letter after discovering this new world, the last part of it is almost all about Christianity and what a great thing this is for the Christian world and what a great thing for the Indians who up until that point had never heard the gospel. And he says so many souls will now be saved, So that's who Christopher Columbus was. And so it really irks me when I see things like Adam Ruins Everything. And it's not just that he has a different perspective or that this is a controversial topic. It's such blatant lies, over-the-top lies, huge omissions, stupid lies. But they run the school system. They run most of the media. And so the leftists assume, these social justice warriors, that, and they're right, actually, they're going to win. You're not going to fact-check them. So at any rate, they're making progress. They're certainly winning. They win most of these debates. In a few generations, it'll just be assumed that Christopher Columbus was a Hitler, the Hitler of his day, something like that. But nothing could be farther from the truth. So I'm going to show you this video really quick, just clips of it from Adam Ruins Everything, and I just want to show you how grotesque the lies are, the omissions. It's not an accident. It's slander, malicious slander and lies against, I think, a great hero and a good man.
The Taino treated Columbus and his crew with the utmost hospitality.
Hug? We need reinforcements!
Columbus repaid their kindness by returning with 17 ships and 1,200 men so he could enslave the Taino and steal their gold.
Okay, so just in that little clip, I'm going to show you a few more, but just in that little clip, there's so many lies and inaccuracies. The only thing that Adam really gets right in that is that Christopher Columbus and the Taino Indians, they get along. They're very hospitable. In fact, they have some sort of ceremony, essentially becoming like blood brothers, Christopher Columbus and this Indian chief. So they actually really hit it off. They get along really well. Another context that's not necessarily shown in the video is why Christopher Columbus is headed east. And it's because they can no longer go, headed west to get to the east. They can no longer go east because the Muslims have taken over most of Africa. They have taken over India. They're taking over Indonesia. They have taken over in 53. They take over Constantinople, which is the great Christian Byzantine city and is kind of the gateway for trade in the east. So the Muslims are taking over all that land, and it's now unsafe for Christians to travel that way. A lot of times the Muslim pirates will go out there and take Christian ships. They'll take their cargo, they'll take the ship, and then they'll enslave the crew. So they're looking for a new route to the east to trade, not to enslave or steal or anything like that, but to trade with the Indians. And it's not just people from India. I think that means everybody, like the Chinese, everybody kind of in the East Indies, they call it. So he does run into this new land. And like I said, the only thing he really gets right is that the Indians are hospitable. They get along really well. They hit it off. And Christopher Columbus, before sailing home, one of his ships, his flagship, the Santa Maria, is wrecked. I think in a lower harbor, they damage the ship, and he realizes it's not going to make it home. He needs to leave some of his sailors behind. So he leaves 39 men behind, and this Indian chief, the Tahino, the very friendly, hospitable Indian chief, promises to protect them, and they are really interested in trade. Both of them are. The Spaniards are really excited. They've discovered a whole new world for them that nobody else has been here. So who knows what sort of spices or materials or whatever they'll be able to trade. And they see gold, so they're excited about that. For the Spaniards, gold is money. That's how they save their wealth. They store their value in gold. To the Indians, they don't really care about it that much. Now, they don't mine it or anything. They find it in the rivers, and they basically hammer it into little discs, and they wear it as, like reflection of the sun, and it shines. It looks beautiful. But for them, it's just decorative. It's not money to them. And so they're happy. They're like, yeah, we have more gold, and we're happy to trade it with you. And they're very interested in the Spaniards' ships because they're an island people. And they usually have to travel in canoes, which I imagine would be, yes, scary if there's a storm or something. And they see these great ships, and they want to learn about how to make these ships from the Spaniards. The other thing is they like the weapons. And they tell Christopher Columbus that they are in a great war with other Indians on other islands. They're the Carib Indians, or the Caribbean. It's named after the Caribbean, but the Carib Indians. And they say that these Indians enslave them and eat them, that they're cannibal Indians. And so the Taino Indians, it's not just this little tribe. There's a whole bunch of tribes, kind of like maybe like a confederation or federation of these Indians, the Taino, and they're up against another group of, a federation, let's say, of Indian tribes, the Caribs. And it's a genocidal war. It's absolutely barbaric, some of the things that they're doing to each other. And so the Taino Indians see the Spaniards as great allies in this war. And they're asking Columbus, like, will you help us? Will you protect us? And we'll trade weapons and things like that. So they both really like each other, okay? And not only do the Spaniards leave behind 39 men in their care because they trust these Indians so much, but the Indian chief gives them some Indians from his tribe to go back to Spain. Now, of course, the leftists are always like, oh, these are the first slaves, but they were sent as ambassadors. They were supposed to be interpreters. They would learn the language, the Spanish language, and then be interpreters between the people. And it was proof. It was proof that Christopher Columbus had found a new world. He wasn't just making it up. He has, some of the people. So they weren't slaves. They were treated very well. And it was kind of like a trading of people, a partnership. They were to be allies. So Christopher Columbus does return with between 1,200 and 700 men. They're not all soldiers. So that sounds really nefarious. A lot of them are not soldiers. A lot of them are craftsmen, miners, things like that. They want to, build a trading post, and they want to go mining for gold, and they know they're going to have to plant, fields. They bring priests, religious people to share the gospel and to be priests, for the people who are settling there. But they do bring a lot of soldiers, not to enslave the Taino Indians. That's a total lie. But this Indian chief has warned them that there's these other very hostile Indians, the Carib Indians, and they're cannibals, and they constantly come over the island and steal people away and enslave them and eat them. So he understands there's hostile Indians out there. He's allied with the Taino Indians, so he's bringing soldiers for his own protection and to protect the Taino Indians, not to enslave them. Okay? So at any rate, they're actually allies. The trading partners. And when Christopher Columbus returns, he assumes they're still allies and trading partners. Okay, next video.
There was only one problem. They didn't have any.
You! Gold! Now!
Oh, I want to help, but what is gold?
This infuriated Columbus, and soon he and his crew began to slaughter them.
This is very inappropriate for me to see.
Adam ruins everything. Okay, Adam wants you to believe that Christopher Columbus meets these super nice Indians, And then he goes home because they're so friendly, and he gets a bunch of soldiers to enslave them and take their gold. Like that's the story. He comes back to the Indian chief and he says, "Hey, I want your gold." And the Indian's like, "What is gold?" Now, even in the video, it's absurd because the Indians look like they're wearing gold and they're wearing these little disc gold, which is what they had. And they did have, and they knew what gold was, and they did have gold. Okay. That was already established before Christopher Columbus left. Okay. And but according to Adam, the Indians are like, "What's gold?" And that makes Christopher Columbus so angry that they don't know what gold is. They're so innocent, they don't even know about gold and money and things like that. But he was so enraged, he decides to massacre all of them. And I mean, that would be horrible. Christopher Columbus, if that was any of that was true, would be a horrible person. But thankfully, that's not true. That's not how it happened. What actually happened is Christopher Columbus came back with his men, and he ran into, well, he didn't hit the same island. He ran into some of the Caribbean Indians, and when they see his ship, they like run away, and they see his soldiers. They're afraid. I think that they think they're like ghosts or something at the time, or spirits, and they leave their slaves. And so there's a whole bunch of Taino women that they actually rescue. They put on the ship, and these Taino Indians tell them how bad the Carib Indians are, and they're horrible, like eating their children. If they're telling the truth. Okay, it's really, really horrible. They basically take the women to be slaves for pregnancy, and then they take the male babies and they raise them up and they sacrifice them and eat them, and it's pretty horrific. If it's all true, if the Taino Indians are telling the truth, so they take the women back to the spot where their settlement was. It was called La Navidad. And that was in honor of the Christmas, because their ship was wrecked on Christmas night. So they named the fort that they built out of the wood for that little settlement fort after Christmas. And when they get there, they don't hit the exact spot of the fort. They hit a little farther down the coast, and they find one of their men, maybe two of their men, I can't remember now, but murdered. I think they slit their throat, and the bodies were pretty fresh. So Columbus was a little bit concerned. He headed quickly back down to the fort, and they find it burned to the ground, and there's bodies everywhere. I don't know that they recover all the bodies, but basically his men have been wiped out. So the 39 men that he left in the Taino care are all massacred. And the Taino Indians are nowhere in sight. There's one or two that are like hiding, they see, and then they run away, so they seem suspicious, but the chief is gone. The village has kind of moved up, we find out later, further up into the mountains. They seem guilty. So Columbus is a little bit nervous. He finally contacts some of the Indians and says, "Hey, I want to meet with the chief." And the chief doesn't want to meet with him. He says that he's been injured in a battle fighting the Carib Indians who slaughtered Columbus's men. So that's the story that they tell. Sorry, my eye is driving me crazy. So that's the story that they tell. Columbus is a little bit, it's not adding up. So finally he meets with the Indian chief. The Indian chief says that he's been wounded in a battle against the Caribs, fighting to protect the settlers. And Columbus, being suspicious, says, I want to see the wound. And the Indian chief says, "No, I don't want to sew it. It's a wound. I don't." And Columbus insists, says, "No, I want to see the wound. 39 of my men are dead. Show me the wound." They uncover the bandages, and there's no wound. So the Indian chief says it's an internal wound. It's like a bruise or something, Needless to say, Columbus is suspicious. Okay. Now, later, there's a meeting on a boat. And remember, he had saved these Taino Indians that were slaves of the Caribs. They were on the boat, the ship still. And some of the Taino chief's men are on the boat talking to Columbus. And that night, they go back onto the shore. They tell the Taino Indians to jump into the water and to swim ashore and to run away, to leave the Spaniards. So this is really suspicious. Columbus catches them and asks them, and the women say, "Oh, they told us to leave you." So now Columbus is really upset. Something shady is going on. This Indian chief that he's become blood brothers with, that was super hospitable, is acting really strange. Finally, the truth comes out. After Columbus left, some of the other Taino Indians that lived on the other side of the island, they found out about the Spaniards in the fort, and they weren't thrilled about it. And the story goes, this is from the Taino's perspective, we'll never hear the dead Spaniards. The story goes that some of the Spaniards were talking to the women, and I think, like, what is it? The tip of the spear or something. Elizabeth Elliot story, those missionaries, that's what I think of. But some of the Spaniards were talking to the Indian women, and the other Indians got angry, supposedly. That's the story. And they killed them. And these weren't the evil Carib Indians. These were the Taino Indians. Now, the original Indian chief who was friends with Christopher Columbus, he did say that he tried to intervene, that he tried to speak up for them, but he said that there's like 60,000 soldiers. And so there's nothing he could do to protect them, he says. And this is probably true because when the war kicks off, and there's going to be a war, this Taino Indian chief doesn't really join the war. He basically flees the island, and he's never heard from again. So that's what he says. He says that there's basically 60,000 warriors coming to wipe you out, and your men have been slaughtered by Taino Indians. Okay? So that's how the war started. That's how the massacre started, okay? They want you to believe it was just because they didn't know what gold was. The Indians attacked Christopher Columbus. And remember, Christopher Columbus couldn't just jump back in his ship and run away all the way back to Spain. He'd have to get provisions, plus all of his men were just slaughtered. And all these men who came over on the ship, they're here to trade. They think that they're going to be enriched. And they thought that they were just going to swap some gold, for like materials and nails to build ships and stuff. They thought this was going to be the easiest money they ever made. And instead, there's 1,700 against maybe 60,000, if the estimates were correct. 60,000, not people, 60,000 soldiers. Okay, so Columbus is vastly outnumbered. It's a horrible situation. It ends up being horrible because the Spaniards have horses, they have war dogs, they have weapons, steel, guns. So it's a horrible war, and the Indians aren't able to overrun the Spaniards. They can hold their ground. They build a fort, and there's a horrible war going on. Anytime the Spaniards, they have no food, so they try to go out and get food from the island. The Indians are waiting to ambush them, and it's just a horrible war. The Spaniards also get really sick. We often talk about us bringing germs like smallpox to the Indians, and that happened. But they also get really sick, the Spaniards. In fact, they start dying faster than the Indians do from the disease of these. They call it jungle fever, but it's just they don't know what the diseases are. There was a whole bunch of them, probably malaria and different things. All they knew is they went into the jungle and then they got really sick. Maybe a third to half of Christopher Columbus's men get sick and die from disease. And they only had 1,700 to start off with. So his own men are mutinous. They thought it was going to be a quick, get rich quick scheme. And in fact, they're being annihilated. They thought they were going to be greeted by these really friendly Indians. And in fact, that was only a small little tribe. And the greater tribe is trying to annihilate them. And it ends up being this horrible war. Okay. So that does happen. They do go to war with the Taino Indians. And a lot of Taino Indians get killed. So do a lot of the Spanish. It wasn't because they didn't know what gold was. It was because they massacred 39 of their men and declared war on the Spaniards. And and that's a little bit more nuanced than just, you don't know what gold is, so I'm angry, I'm going to kill all of you.
Columbus's regime was so senselessly brutal that by 1542, the Taino population on the island had fallen to 200.
I can't believe it. I had no clue that Columbus was this cruel.
Okay, the last lie is that Christopher Columbus, when he came, there was 250,000 Indians, and when he left, there was 200. Okay. Well, first of all, a lot of Indians died. Okay, so did a lot of the Spanish. First of all, there were many reasons for this. One was they were at war with each other, and a lot of people died in the war. We don't know exactly how many people that there was. They range from estimates of 60,000 to 150,000, which is significant. And they range from how many soldiers there were, from 30,000 to 60,000. These are kind of like the estimates. They didn't take a census. They don't know exactly what the numbers were. But still, that's significant. Let's say it was 150,000, not 250. I don't know where I do know where he gets that number, and I'll tell you in a little bit. But let's say there's 150,000. There's zero evidence that it was down to 200. Okay. There was one quasi-historian. He actually becomes a lawyer for the Indians, and he claims that the numbers were in the hundreds. I don't know why they settled on 200. Maybe that sounds really nefarious, but either way, if you go from thousands, 150,000 or even 60,000 into the hundreds, it's pretty bad. But there's a lot of reasons to believe that that's inaccurate. But there's no doubt that the population was greatly reduced for many reasons, though. One was the war. The wars was brutal. Two, when the Indians realized they really couldn't defeat the Spaniards, they had armor, they had forts, they had steel, they had cannons. Like the Indians really were naked and had some spears and bow and arrows and stuff. There was no way that they could take on the Spaniards, and they were afraid of them. So they decided to do a scorched earth where they basically burned all the crops on the island. And they thought that that would make the Spaniards go away, but the Spaniards didn't. And now they had no food. So both the Spaniards and the Indians began to starve. There's no food on the island, okay? Also, there was disease. So the Indians got probably smallpox, and the Spaniards also got sick. So how did we get to 200? Well, we didn't get to 200. That's just a made up number. But how did we reduce the population? Well, what probably happened was an exodus. In fact, that seems to be what happened. Was basically there was no food on the island, and they were losing the war, the Taino Indians, and they were getting sick, and so most of them just left the island. Okay, they just left. They got on boats and they went to other places. And there's lots of evidence of this because the Taino Indians, I believe they've even found them up in Florida. They're basically all over, but they left their island, some of their islands, okay, as the Spaniards came. They just retreated to the mainland. Some of them stayed and they intermarried. And so that accounts for some of the numbers diminishing. The ones that did stay started to basically just marry with the Spaniards and create families. And now they were a mixed race. They were no longer in the Taino tribe. They were part of the Spanish colony. But a lot of people died in the war. I don't want to diminish that. It was horrible. I guess if the Spaniards hadn't come, they wouldn't have died in the war. But if the Spaniards hadn't come, they would have continued to die in the war against the Caribs. So it wasn't like they were all peace and everything was harmonious until the Spaniards came. And remember, the Spaniards didn't start the war. They came to be trading partners. They were welcomed. They were given some land by the Taino Indians. And I think that they meant well. If you read Christopher Columbus's letters, he's very excited to meet them. He thinks they're going to be great trading partners. He gets back and 39 of his men are slaughtered. So I don't know what you do. You just ignore it and go back home, give up. What do you do? He also finds out this huge army is coming to fight him. He doesn't have resources, just go home. I don't know that he should have gone just home. Like I said, his men were slaughtered by these people. They declared war on them, and they fought the war, and they did end up taking over the island. And I think the best explanation for why the population of Taino went down so much, it's not because Christopher Columbus slaughtered all of them, but because most of them just got in boats and left. And that's what the original accounts say. That the island at one point just was empty. They don't actually know where they all went. There was these wars and there was no food and everything. And then the Taino Indians just kind of like disappeared from the island. So they probably got in boats and went to other islands. And that was pretty common. They would get in boats and travel several days, go to the next island, kind of island hop. That's how the Carib Indians came over to steal people. They'd come over in canoes and boats and kidnap a bunch of slaves and then take them back to their island, okay? So at any rate, they weren't wiped out. It wasn't genocidal. They basically did lose the island, and they went to different areas, and they probably went to the mainland. I'm not saying that that's perfect or that that's good, but that's very different than they didn't know what gold was, so Christopher Columbus slaughtered all of them. 250,000 down to 200. See, that's horrific. That's absurd. Now, I know that there are lots of other arguments against Christopher Columbus, and I'm aware of most of them. I'm not debunking all of them today, but they can all be debunked simply by going to the historical record. And I highly recommend you guys find a curriculum for your kids that uses source material, because the right is just as guilty. And often they are just yesterday's liberals. People don't understand that. The conservative movement is just yesterday's Democrats, okay? And this has been going on for hundreds of years. So many of these other conservative sources are just telling you yesterday's myth. They're telling you that Christopher Columbus was a genocidal maniac, but like yesterday's version of that, like the Crusades or something. Most people concede that the Crusades was, the Christianity trying to spread the religion with the sword, and they were evil, and they committed atrocities. They've totally maligned the Crusades. The Crusades was actually a defensive war, protecting the Byzantine Christians from the Muslim invasion. Eventually, it failed, and the Muslims took over the Byzantine Empire, took over Constantinople. Okay, how do you think the Muslims got Jerusalem? Okay, I said that one time, and somebody said, "Well, how do you think the Christians got it?" And see what I mean? They don't know their history. The Christians inherited it when Constantine converted to Christianity. So it was Romans. The Romans conquered Jerusalem, not the Christians. But the Romans, a Roman emperor, eventually converted to Christianity, and Christianity eventually became the official religion of the entire Roman Empire. And that's how the Christians inherited it. So they didn't actually take it from anybody. And then the Muslims came through and took it by force. They conquered the city. And then Western Christians decided to go to the defense of the Eastern Byzantine Christians. So that's how that happened. But I'm telling you, you have to be careful. Be careful. The history, they've been rewriting history for a long time.